thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you for those who have attended this session. I want to dive right in. We've been asked to look at internal Russian responses and impacts of the war in Ukraine. We're going to zoom out, zoom in, zoom back out, and hopefully have time for some questions. So, as you all know, Russia is a giant country. It has 80-some constituent territories, and the overwhelming majority of those are not self-sufficient financially. They rely on Moscow for their funding. The war is very costly. Moscow's resources are finite, they're limited, and so the depletion of those resources is hitting the regions in very different ways. Some analysts are already saying, look, the Russian Federation is looking very fragile. So I want to begin with Andrei, who is both an economist and many years ago had worked directly advising the Russian government, who so has a unique perspective on this. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about how you see the depletion of these resources that are being used up in the war affecting the internal Russian situation, Moscow's relationship with the regions, and more generally.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to this conference. Let me start, first of all, with the title for the whole conference, which is in the upper right corner. I think it's incorrect. It says war in Ukraine. It is not true. It is war against Ukraine. And this is actually the style that which is very much liked by Kremlin, just to put in the center of attention Ukraine, but avoid attention of the main culprit of this war, Russia or Kremlin or Putin. So the correct title should be the title of our session, War Against Ukraine, or Russian War Against Ukraine, or Kremlin War Against Ukraine, or Putin's War Against Ukraine. Second, many people already have said that this war has been launched on February 24th, 2022. It is not true. The conventional war against Ukraine has been launched on February 20th, 2014. So that is why we are now almost for full 9 years of this war. But this is only one part of the big imperialist war that Mr. Putin has launched. And he has launched this war not only against Ukraine, but also against Georgia in year 2008, against Moldova, against many other nations, against Europe. So that is, and also it is war against freedom, against democracy, against human rights, in many other countries, including in Russia. So this is a very long war. Now coming to your very important questions. Military analysts, as well as geopolitical analysts and economic analysts, are looking for a number of most important factors that allow Putin or Kremlin to wage this war and continue this war. I would mention some of them, especially it has been discussed at the first session. The losses of the Russian troops in this war against Ukraine, probably total, is up to 200,000 people, including those who have been killed, wounded, taken prisoners of war, and so on. It's enormous number, it's enormous losses, but as we know right now, up to today, Kremlin was able to mobilize more than 530,000 new conscripts. In addition to those, probably between 200,000 and 300,000 Russian troops already fighting in this war. So the total number, it could be already close to 700,000 to 800,000 troops ready to participate or already participating in this war. But it's not the end of the story. According to a number of estimates, Putin will be able to mobilize up to 1.4 or maybe 1.5 million people by the end of this coming winter. So that is why the size of Russian army will be multiplied. We need to look into the total number of reserves, mobilization reserve for Russia. Now it's been calculated that it is between 25 and 29 million people. So we don't know, we're not sure that all of those people will be mobilized, but definitely assuming the desperation of Mr. Putin in his desire to achieve victory in this war against Ukraine and against Europe, we cannot exclude that there will be new waves of mobilization with many more people. Assuming the rate of losses on the battlefield, it means that this war can last for years. Second very important factor is the availability of military equipment. So there are different numbers exist for different elements of military equipment like tanks, artillery pieces, jets, helicopters, all other stuff. Based on the most reliable estimates of the losses on the battlefield, during these 8 months of war, Russia lost, depending on different items, between 10 to 25% of military equipment. It is not hard to estimate if between 10 and 25% of equipment have been lost. So Russia is still in possession, at least for the most important elements of equipment like tanks, between 75 to 90% of equipment that it had at the beginning of this latest stage of the war.
Well, I think we've heard the most important thing. That
let me finish with the last one, because it gives us the perspective how much this war can be waged. So that is why, assuming even this critical element of these losses, it means this war can last at least for 2 more years, even, let's say, rely on the number of available tanks. The next one, probably even the most important factor that could allow us to calculate how long this war can last is the volume of foreign exchange reserves in Russia. First of all, at the very beginning of this stage of the war, on February 21st, the foreign exchange reserves of Russia would allow Putin to wage this war for at least 4 years. After the Western countries frozen up to $300 billion in foreign exchange reserve, and after Russia lost slightly more than $100 billion in reserve over the last 8 months, and assuming some other little facts that we don't have time now to discuss, those liquid part of the foreign exchange reserve that is still in possession of Kremlin would allow it to continue war, probably not more than for 17 and 18 months. This calculation gives us a very important idea what are the most crucial directions of the joint efforts, both of Ukraine and partners of Ukraine and allies of Ukraine, how to get to the victory in this war and how bring closer the end of this bloody war.
So thank you very much. So we're looking at a very long story, right? At least 1.5 years more. And I want to turn to Alexandra, who's, as a sociologist, you've done some work exploring there's a whole stratum in Russia of educated people, so-called technocrats, who have been quite impressive from a Russian domestic standpoint of keeping the economy functioning, the country functioning. Certainly sanctions and all the costs of the war have hit the Russian population, but in a much lighter way than many people have predicted. And that is in part thanks to this stratum of technocrats. So tell us a little bit about why these people keep working. Is it just fear, or is there something else happening there? You've studied this.
Hello, and thanks for having me here. So speaking about Russian elites, especially about Russian technocrats, they're divided on 2 camps, so-called peace camp and war camp. And people from the war camp, that's mostly those who works in the government or in the economic sector. Well, they're actually, those with whom I spoke and as my colleagues spoke, they're actually against the war, but they're very reluctant to become vocal about it. Of course, they're scared to death because, well, they really think that if they will stand opposed in public of the war, they will immediately go to jail. That's also the reason why they're still keeping their positions. And the second And the second reason why they're still in Russia and why they continue doing what they do is, as I calling it's a habit of it's a habit to be efficient. Because last 10 years, last 10 years, what they are keeping to being efficient, that was the main goal of what they're doing. And a huge part of being efficient was not taking part in politics. So they do only economy. They showed that they showed with themselves that politics can be separated from economics. So even now, they're speaking about the war in terms of efficacy. So they are quite. They think that Putin is not very efficient with the war, and Ministry of Defense and these paramilitants who are taking part with the war, that they can behave on the battlefield much more efficient, which is, well, I was surprised to hear that from them. So they're still continuing to do that. And I think that now, in spring, they were not. They did not feel themselves like those who are taking part in the war. They were just spectators of it. So. The war actually concerned them when the mobilization was started, and now we can see that lots of people flew away, and lots of people who work in central bank, in state governments, that they leave the country and continue to work remotely. So that's talking about the peace camp. And the war camp, I actually feel that there are only few of people who are really, will be glad to see tanks in Kiev, but mostly these people are anticipating the hawkish mood of Putin. They are, they're very loud on internet, and, they are not influenced any decisions that Putin can take.
Thank you. Yeah, so I know that in your work you also noted that a lot of these people, they sort of are used to breaking certain rules in the pursuit of their efficiency.
Yeah.
Maxim, I want to then move on to you with the question, thanks to, in large part, to these technocrats, for ordinary Russians, again, up until the mobilization was announced, they could live ignoring the war largely. And certainly, we saw in public opinion polling very old cleavages emerge, where younger people who get their news mostly online were slightly more pro-Western, and older people who get their news from state television were quite rabidly anti-Western, but nonetheless, the government's, especially Putin's, approval ratings have remained incredibly high, even caveats about public opinion polling notwithstanding. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the moods, the trends in the moods in public opinion in Russia, and how you see them developing and unfolding.
Yeah, you have mentioned many important factors. I think we, surprisingly, for such a repressive dictatorship, we can speak quite freely and about the results of opinion polls in Russia, and they still remain quite reliable. And what we can state now is that Russian society, the majority of Russian society, does support this war, but is not very enthusiastic about this war. Yeah, we see that even after the mobilization, the share of Russians who support the war remains very high, surprisingly high, over 70%, up to 80%. But that's, some people explain this, that people are just afraid to tell that they're against the war. And probably it's true in some cases, but I think in the majority of cases, it's rather that people just naturally support their country which is at war. They don't dwell too much into details, and it's just an instinct. Yeah, our country is at war. We have been brought up in the atmosphere where sacrifices for the sake of war is the supreme merit. So we should sacrifice everything we have because our country is at war. Yeah, and we should not doubt it. This was the whole upbringing that Russia kept from the Soviet times. So I think this is quite realistic figures that this support is over 70% overall. But if you just make a step aside and ask people some more detached questions, like how do you feel about the current situation, you see that actually that Russian society is not really happy about what is going on. We see that the share of people who feel despair, stress, fear is almost half of the society, yeah, which demonstrates very negative tendencies in the public mood. And if, for example, the support for ending the war, for starting negotiations, is also rising and is surprisingly high. Depending on the poll, it's over the half of the population. Yeah, so we see that people are ready to support Russia because it's waging the war, ready to support the government because it's waging the war in the name of their country, but still they'd rather prefer to have this war stopped. And generational privileges, which are also very important. We see it's probably the most important factor determining whether a person supports the war or not. We see that in the age brackets below 30 years, below 40 years, the support for the war dives down extremely. In the most among the retired people, it's over 90%, while among people below 35, you have like less than a half are supporting the war. And I think it's not only because they get the news from a different source, not only because they use internet, but also because the Russian propaganda is designed in the way to appeal to the older generations, to Soviet generations. Because its main viewer of this propaganda is Putin himself, who is of this Soviet older generation. So the whole propaganda is not even intended to appeal to younger people. It is intended to appeal to older people. And the second is that the costs for younger generations of Russia are much higher than the ones for the older generations. It's younger Russians who are losing their career opportunities, who are deprived of the ability to live fashionable Western style of life. It's younger Russians who are being mobilized, so little wonder that they are less supportive of the war than the older generations.
Those are very good points, certainly, and their planning horizons have shrunk tremendously. And you mentioned propaganda, and Alexandra, I wanted to come back to you. You know, part of the description of this panel was that the Russian government has definitely tightened the space for dissent, for a free exchange of opinions, and I wanted to ask you to describe some of the mechanisms now at work, some of the propaganda tactics, some of the fear tactics. We certainly, I see, you know, certainly among the older Russians with whom I speak, very much this sense that the West is against us, the West is attacking us, the West has surrounded us. It harkens back to their younger days. It's a very recognizable paradigm, and it's re-entrenched itself quite well. But talk to us about more generally about propaganda and fear.
Right, but first I want to bring some numbers to Maxim's answer, that there was a recent poll made by, I think, Russian Field, that's independent sociology company. So, and the answer was that 60% of Russians would support Putin if he launched a new attack on Kyiv, but more than 75% will support Putin if he stops the war right now. Yeah. And that's the same amount of people, which obviously shows that they will support any decision of the government.
Well, it's more would support the end,
but
right? 75% would support the end.
Will support the end, and I truly believe that Russian society will support the end of this war and will be happy about it. And speaking about propaganda, as it was mentioned, right, so the Kremlin designed very good tools to influence the older people, But speaking about overall in economics, what they're trying to do, they're trying to paint the economic picture of Russian stand not in the real blue colors as it is. So there is a demand from Kremlin to speak in public that in economics everything is going well. There is some sort of Kremlin newspeak they're using. So when they're calling decline negative growth, because growth sounds more happier than decline. Yeah. So an economy minister or Putin's economic aide, Maxim, often they are speaking that well, Russian economy is going well, and well, the economic ties will renew, we will rebuild, we'll have much more other customers in the rest of the world. That only the West is against Russia, but the rest on the war is, well, they still want to trade with Russia, and they just saying this for many times, and I think that some of them become the victims of their own propaganda. They are not, well, they have pink glasses on their eyes, and they don't see the real picture, actually. Well, because in the March, when I spoke with some people working in the government, they were absolutely, well, they believed that China will come, China and India will come and will help with microchips, with techniques, with all those imports which were banned by the West. And they were really surprised that neither China nor India didn't came, and that Russia will face such problems with imports.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I want to for a moment go from the what's happening in Russia now to turn to Andrei with a bit of a more aspirational question. The motto of those Russians who oppose the war is peace to Ukraine, freedom to Russia. So if we think about a long-term perspective or a medium-term perspective, and if you think about this idea of a free Russia, in practice, what would that mean? How would it be achieved? Is it even something worth talking about at this point?
I think it's a very important point, and it's very deeply intertwined with each other, both issues, peace for Ukraine and freedom for Russia. Earlier today, Maria Zolkin has said something very important, that the final victory for Ukraine can be achieved not only when all occupied territories will be liberated from occupying forces, but when Russia, regardless what kind of Russia, today's Russia, tomorrow's Russia, will not present any threat to Ukraine, and I would add to Georgia, to Moldova, to Baltic countries, to Belarus, to whole Europe, to Kazakhstan, to any country around the world. So that is why the root of the problem is in the title of our conference. As you remember, it is authoritarianism as the cause of the war. So this is a problem. So that is why in this kind of strategically thinking, the peace for Ukraine can be achieved only when the authoritarian system in Russia will cease to exist. This is a very simple and very brutal truth for everybody. As long as authoritarian regime exists in Russia and controls Kremlin, so there will be danger and there will be threat and risk for new wars against Ukraine, against other countries. So that is why we need to understand that there are several goals in this war, in this big war, and this war is not only war against Ukraine, but once again, this war against freedom and democracy, rule of law and human rights. The first step, yes, it's a liberation of all occupied territories of Ukraine. Second is providing security for Ukraine and other countries surrounding Russia. And the final solution to this problem is the freedom for Russia, which means destruction of authoritarian regime in the country.
Well, I'd like to pick up there and talking about the authoritarian regime in the country. There's a great debate, obviously, about to what extent is there a structural problem in Russia, and to what extent are the problems with authoritarianism in Russia, to what extent do they hinge on Putin as an individual? And in the West, certainly there has been a tendency to demonize Putin somewhat, and the most recent U.S. national security strategy, for example, more or less says that we're not going to try to deal with Russia while Putin is still in place. So, Maxim, I want to turn to you and ask you about this, because I would like to, in the previous panel, Iskra made a very clear distinction, for example, between the war as an imperialist project and the war as a great power competition. And she felt that it was the former, not the latter. But I would like to very much invite everyone present to just consider the possibility that in the minds of the Kremlin, that both things can be true. That yes, Ukraine is regarded as something not worthy of its own decisions. It's seen as a buffer, as a strategic buffer after decades of Russian military strategic thinking, of seeing Russia as vulnerable to attack from without, that there is this long tradition of seeing these threats as real. And so I wanted to ask Maxim, when eventually somebody will succeed Putin, we all go the same direction, right? So when that does happen, what do you see as the chances for a real break, a real discontinuity from his authoritarian repressive policies? And what do you see as the chances for some measure of continuity in whatever government comes next?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, Putin was not imposed on Russia by aliens. He is the product of Russian reality, and his world outlook is shared by wider Russian ruling elite, of course. But I think in case of this war, it was very much his personal project and his personal obsession. So in the eventuality when we don't know under what circumstances he lives, he'll most probably will be replaced by one of his henchmen, probably with a security background, probably with similar world outlook. And this will bring quite high degree of continuity in the Russian policies. Yeah, that it will still remain an authoritarian country, it will still remain strongly anti-Western, but still, this new leadership, no matter who succeeds Putin, will be much more collective. And this will make it much more cautious, at least, and much more pragmatic, much more rational in many questions, and much easier to deal with. And what is most important, much less obsessed with Ukraine. Because even on the eve of this war, in the last days before the invasion started in February, we saw that the key Russian dignitaries were very hesitant. They were not very enthusiastic about the starting of the war. Everybody who had some influence actually somehow opposed it, even putting it, even packaging it in a very anti-Western way. They still, even at the last session of Russian Security Council, we saw a lot of high dignitaries saying in favor of continuing negotiations with the West. Yeah? And it just because it was Putin's personal decision to start the invasion, and they had to adhere to it. So they are much less obsessed with Ukraine, much more pragmatic, and any collective leadership is still much more flexible and easier to deal with than a personal leadership of a person who is not really in touch with reality any longer.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to, on that note, I'd like to go around from panelist to panelist. And you know, another word in the title of our panel is a watershed moment. So I'd like to ask each of you in turn to, from among the topics that we've discussed today, perhaps ones that we haven't touched upon, where do you see the potential in the current situation for watershed moments for the Russian position in this war against Ukraine right now? So Andrei, why don't we start with you?
If I may, just to comment on the previous question
Absolutely.
that we started to discuss, what is the deepest root of the Russian problems, of the Putin's problem or Russia's problem and so on. I see here at least 5 levels of problems, and each of them must be addressed. The first one is a personal issue of Mr. Putin, and it is very well understood now around the world. Second is the problem of corruption of a very small group of people who back in 1999 have chosen this person to become president of Russia. I would mention these names. Some of the, probably you haven't heard these names, but those 3 people are responsible for that the country has such a person as a president, for all these wars and the hundreds of thousands of people being killed. Valentin Yumashev, Tatiana Dichenko, daughter of President Yeltsin, and Alexandra Voloshin. These 3 people have chosen that person and pushed him for the presidency. Third problem is institutional one, including the institutional design of the Russian constitution adopted in 1993. Fourth is the Soviet heritage. Country never had the real de-Sovietization and decommunization. That is a crucial element for sustaining democracy, freedom, and human rights in the country. And the fifth is the heritage of the cultural heritage that is common for some, let me say openly, for some Eastern Orthodox countries. And from this point of view, Serbia and Russia also sharing some elements of that predisposal for appearance of such people and such stories in our countries. Coming to the most important question about the watershed. The long-term wars of attritions are being some kind of decided, first of all, not on the battlefield, but in the area of military finance. Before to beat the enemy on the battlefield, you need to have at least military financial parity, which means that your military expenditures should be at least equal with the military expenditure of the enemy. That was exactly the solution to the Second World War. Only when the allies, United States, United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union had military expenditures combined more than military expenditures of Axis, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and militarist Japan, they were able to achieve the turning point in the Second World War. Something similar is true for this war. Unfortunately, today, the military expenditure of Russia today is 2.5 times higher than Ukraine and partners of Ukraine that are supplying military equipment and armaments and so on to Ukraine. Russia spends today about $15 billion monthly. Ukraine spends roughly $4 billion monthly, and all military aid to Ukraine that's delivered to Ukraine is $2 billion US. So altogether $6 billion. This military aid is absolutely not enough to sustain this war, to get the military parity, and more to achieve victory. If this military help, military aid will not be increased, let's say 5 times from the current level, the military victory for Ukraine and allies and partners are not achievable. It should be understood absolutely clear. This is a blunt truth. So that is why partners and friends and allies of Ukraine must increase military aid to Ukraine many folds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's the aid. Aid is going to be a
watershed. Only having achieved this military financial parity, Ukrainians on the battlefield will be able to achieve real victory on the fronts.
Alexandra, what are some of the watersheds you're thinking about?
I want to agree with Maxim's point that next Russian leadership will be much more pragmatic and less obsessed with the Ukraine. And what I know now for sure about Russian technocrats, that they feel themselves much more cornered than Putin. And if Putin chosen the escalation tactics, they think that, well, okay, but he's the devil, we know. They do not agree, but they are okay with this. Because they don't see any exit from the corner the West put them here. They're losing money, they're losing influence, they don't feel themselves safe, and maybe it's very unpopular, but maybe some talks with, maybe showing them some point of, not an exit, but maybe a point of that exit, of the possible exit from this corner, will be helpful to stop this conflict and, yeah.
Yeah, I think by many, I think many Russian elites do feel quite cornered because the sanctions that were meant to persuade them to exert pressure on Putin did not take into account that they have no influence on Putin. So instead, what happened is many of the Western sanctions imposed on Russian elites leave them in a more powerless situation than they were in before. Maxim, what are you thinking about watershed moments?
I'm thinking more about path dependency than about watershed moments, because I think the moment the decision to start the invasion was taken was a fatal one for the Russian regime. And now it's very difficult to ramp off. because it has to go on and on with the escalation. And I'm deeply convinced that no matter what security guarantees Ukraine can ever get from the Western countries, as long as Putin is in power in Russia, as long as he's in power, he'll still be obsessed with Ukraine. Ukraine is not safe. It's just, it will keep going and going and going. Of course, deteriorating, but continuing.
Yeah. I don't know if it'll be a watershed moment. I am curious to see what will happen in December when some of the new restrictions on European purchases of Russian energy take into effect, whether that will help achieve some of this, whether this will help put a dent in some of Russia's finances. That'll be an interesting thing to watch. And I see that we've sped along so well that perhaps we'll have a moment before opening the floor to questions. I did want to ask Maxim, even though we've been asked to talk mostly about Russia domestically, I know that you've been looking very recently at the impact that the war has had on Russia's relations with some of the other former states, former Soviet republics, now independent states. And I wonder if you could just point out some of the key dynamics there to watch.
The key dynamic is very simple, is that Russia is so consumed by the war with Ukraine that it has no spare resources to upkeep its presence in other post-Soviet states, except for Belarus, which is in fact under de facto military occupation of Russia at the moment. We see that Russia's degree of control over Russia's ability to influence other countries of post-Soviet space has been undermined severely, and we see that Russia is almost outflanked in the negotiations on Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now the West all of a sudden has taken the leading role as a mediator. We see that Russia has very tense relations with the new leadership of Kazakhstan, and we see even that some smaller countries of Central Asia who are very dependent, still very dependent on Russia economically and in terms of security, their leadership dares to criticize Putin in person, in his presence, in public. So we see that another loss caused by the war in Ukraine for Russia is its influence in the post-Soviet space.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think with that, we're able to open up the floor to questions. And I see the gentleman in the desk right there.
Thank you. Goran Buldivsky, Open Society Foundation's excellent panel. I really enjoyed so many questions. I'll ask two. I reside in Berlin. There, they don't talk about Ukraine victory. They talk about Russia must not win. And it's a very careful statement. Can you unpack it from your perspective of view? What does it mean Russia cannot win? And my second question is, can you think about this, Maxim, you alluded now to these opportunities. The first time EU will send basically a peacekeeping mission in Nagorno-Karabakh, something that was terra incognita. What are the opportunities that are opening there? But can you elaborate a bit more? What does it mean for the elites in Moscow? And what does it mean for equally authoritarian elites in Turkey and whatnot? Because I believe the constellation is not just by the individual leader. These are elites that really are around this set of ideas. This will not die just with the change of the leader. So, too many questions, pick and choose. Thank you.
Should we go for everything? Right?
Yeah, Maxim, maybe you will start with the one that was directed to you, and then we can go around.
Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm not sure that the current audience is really interested in Nagorno-Karabakh. Okay, but just a short answer that this was made possible by the war. Yeah, that Russia all of a sudden, actually, it's that the rule-based world order is more attractive to smaller countries than the Russia's philosophy of realpolitik, where small countries have only to suffer, yeah, because of big countries. And so there is little wonder that both for Armenia and Azerbaijan, despite all their mutual acrimonies, the West turned out to be a more appropriate mediator than Russia is, because Russia kept pursuing its own interests in the region, and both countries, all of a sudden, turned out to be more interested in the Western mediation. How far it will go, we are not sure. probably the prospects of Russia's presence in the region are very low because its closest ally, Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, was the root of Russia's presence in the South Caucasus. Yeah? And without this conflict, Russia will lose its key ally in the region, Armenia. Yeah? Because without Karabakh, Armenia can pursue its integration with the West, or cooperation with the West, in a far more active manner. And now we see that already the backdrop for these developments are created when Armenia, despite being attacked by Azerbaijan already on its Armenian territory, Armenia is not really supported by Russia in this difficult minute, but it's supported by the West. And the West has already, over the past few months, just in several weeks, has created a lot of goodwill in Armenia, while Russia has lost all the goodwill it has accumulated over the past decades. So I'm quite skeptical about the prospects of Russia's presence in the South Caucasus, at least in the foreseeable future in the next few years.
And now if we are to address this, the formulation in the West of that there's not talk of Ukraine's victory, but that Moscow cannot win, even though I suspect that this is more rooted in a European situation and context than on the ground. But Andrei, do you have any thoughts on that, on this distinction?
I think the best translation of this formula, Russia cannot win, is Russia's defeat. It's just only one plausible translation and explanation, because otherwise, as once again it has been explained this early session as well as in many other places, if somehow this line, front line will be preserved, some kind of with a part of Ukrainian territories being occupied, it means that after some pause in this military action, Kremlin, Putin, or whoever who could come after Putin would accumulate more forces, mobilize more resources, and will launch another war. It will be continuation of this war. When we were talking about after year 2008, after Russian-Georgian war, not very many people believed us. When we talked about after year 2014-15, that will be continuation of this war, still some people did not believe. Now in year 2022, everybody in Georgia, Ukraine, in all post-Soviet space, and many people around the world understand it very clearly. If the root of the problem, the regime in Kremlin, is not changed, the war will continue. It means more hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, will perish in new wars. So that is why our purpose is just what we say, peace not only for Ukraine, peace for the world. And this peace for the world can be achieved only through destruction of authoritarian regime in Moscow.
Well, I'll take advantage of my position as moderator to add that I think that the paradox of this formula, that what we're after is that Moscow cannot win, is that we cannot allow Moscow to use force to change sovereign boundaries in Europe, to, right, it can't be might makes right. We cannot succumb to this reality that Russia is trying to force on the world. But of course, the grand obstacle to this is how many human lives, how much money, how many resources is the West willing to invest in this battle, right? Because Russia has already violated Ukraine's sovereignty, it has violated Georgia's sovereignty, but the cost-benefit analysis of, say, NATO and the Western nations of, how much do we risk? Do we risk a full-out war with Russia in order to prevent this encroachment on the sovereignty of smaller countries? In the cost-benefit analysis, in the context of realpolitik, the decision was made, no, the costs are too high. So this tension is going to remain, right? Because the costs are going to be the same. So I think this is the dilemma that we're going to be facing for quite a long time.
I think, speaking of this, we need to define the victory. And in my humble opinion, the victory is that Russia will never be a threat to the Ukraine ever. So I don't know when and how it will be achieved, but I think that's the victory also, not only for the Ukraine or for the Europe, but also for Russia. And that's the point where the forces should be implied.
Yeah.
Just in my opinion, the formula Russia cannot win means that Europe is afraid of Russia's defeat, because this defeat might imply unpredictable circumstances. Yeah, and so you need to package it in the way that is, on the one hand, not offensive to Ukrainians, but on the other hand, conveys the fear of Europe, of Russia's defeat, of major destabilization of huge nuclear power right on the border of Europe.
And if I may just, some people in the world kept forgetting that the war against Europe, against the world, is not it's issue of tomorrow, it's issue of today, yesterday. So we know about this explosion on pipelines. We know about this person who have been killed in the downtown of Berlin. We know about people who have been poisoned in London. We know about the military stock that have been exploded in Czech Republic. We know about the person who have been poisoned in Bulgaria. All this happened in Europe, and this is war against Europe. It's going on for years. People should not be blind and deaf and to see reality.
I want
And also, once more, the attempt to overthrow the government in Montenegro.
Yeah, I do want to, I think Maxim has made a very good point also, that there's a very fragile balance also between, yes, we want Russia to stop, but we don't want it to collapse or go ballistic, just feel that it has so much nothing to lose that it can unleash everything. But again, the tension is very old. Even when under the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, right, Ukraine was, we call them in shorthand that Ukraine was given security guarantees that Russia has violated. But in fact, when the diplomatic wrangling over the language of the Budapest Memorandum was happening, the lawyers in Washington, in the administration, were adamant that the word guarantees not be used, that there were assurances, because they understood that to give binding guarantees in this situation would commit them to an Article 5-like defense of Ukraine that they were not willing to underwrite and undertake then, and still this poses a major security challenge, right? The idea of a clash, a full-on clash with Russia, that challenge remains. Do we have any more questions? Yes, please.
First of all, thank you very much for the excellent panel. It was quite a show. I want to ask a question about statistics, and it's about the statistics you mentioned about support to Putin. How do you think this statistics relates to those people who already fled Russia? And I mean specifically those who fled the mobilization effort, not the ones that fled before. Thank you very much.
As far as I know, the survey of Russian field was made in the beginning of October, so the mobilization was announced, but they spoke to people online. So basically, there is a part of people who are in Russia and who are outside of Russia, and they're not showing us the number, the division. But this actually correlates with the other polls made by FCIOM or polls made by FOM who speak with people within Russian borders. So we can see that most part of Russians, well, Russians are contempt in politics. They don't like, they have a habit not to make politics, not to be political. So basically, I think that these numbers are correlate with the other numbers in Russia. So we have most part of Russians who will support any decision of the government, and if it will be peaceful decision, we will see more Russians supporting this.
I think we shouldn't exaggerate the scale of Russian emigration. It's very big in absolute numbers, but in terms of percentage of the Russian society, it's very small. And at the most, the estimates are maybe 1 million people has left Russia over this year, but it's less than 1% of the Russian population. It's a very small figure.
Yeah. I'd like to add also, to point out that Russia from Soviet times has a very deep tradition of allowing certain escape valves for public discontent. So even now, you have, with the mobilization, you have the most pro-Kremlin, the most rabid presenters on state television saying how bad these military guys are who allowed all these young untrained conscripts to be thrown into the meat grinder. We should have them all shot. We should have them all jailed, right? So the Tsar is good and the boyars are bad. There's an old tradition of finding ways to let off steam without, you know, but not one bad word about the party, you know, kind of tradition. We had,
If I may, just a little point, which is absolutely correct, that this, in relative terms, less than 0.5% of the population, maybe for adult population, maybe 1%. So that is why it probably would not affect substantially the results that have been announced already. But it is there is one more very painful point. Some of the people who left, who fled Russia out because of mobilization, still have very imperialistic views. And many people who have been interviewed, let's say in Kazakhstan, after fleeing the mobilization, were not able to say directly who built Crimea, whom it does belong, whether it's Ukrainian or Russian. So that is why the problem of mindset and mentality and the culture court is a very serious and very deep, and it is not something that can be treated very easily in a very short period of time.
Absolutely. The young woman in the white. And then.
Hi, thank you. I'm Valentina Valjak. I'm actually representing Munich Security Conference here. We had a motto on our conference in February saying peace through dialogue. And this is just a comment and question to Mr. Illarionov's saying that peace is only possible through destruction of the authoritarian regime. I just wanted to ask, what is with dialogue? Is dialogue here possible? Will Russia ever be opened for a dialogue?
Russia, definitely some part of Russia is open for dialogue, but we need to be very careful what kind of part of Russia. When we are dealing with a criminal, with a murder, with a person who is responsible for murdering of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, not only of citizens of other countries, but citizens of own country, who has demonstrated that he's unable, he's just unable to keep his word. He violated all obligations, all promises that he has given for the last 22, 23 years. So he has signed a number of documents, including with Ukraine, including about the demarcation of the Russian-Ukrainian border with Ukrainian presidents. And he violated those documents. He violated all those documents with Georgia, with all other, with many other places. So that is why the question is, when we have such a person or such people who violated and demonstrated their desire to violate tomorrow and day after tomorrow, what should we do with them?
Karsten, you had a question? Okay.
Thank you. My name is Karsten Friis. I'm from Oslo, Norway. Thank you for a great panel. I would like to just offer a little bit more optimistic view about Western support. Because after all, what Putin has managed is really to rally Western leaders together in a unity we haven't seen and not been able to do ourselves, for many, many years. And we've seen over this period of the war, whenever the maybe the stamina has gone down and the support has seemed to be dwindled a little bit, something happens that wakes us up and oops, yeah, we have to get our act together again. So, I mean, it is the level of sanctions and the level of weapons is unique, really. And I'm quite convinced that we didn't throw all this weapon at Ukraine to make Ukraine lose or to give up. I'm quite sure Western powers will stay there, and especially the United States, with bipartisan support, will continue to support Ukraine as long as it takes, because there's no real alternative, because we all agree what the alternative is. So yeah, I want to throw out a bit more optimistic analysis to you and see what your response is. Thank you.
I would prefer to see Western leaders disunited, but to have all those Ukrainian kids who have been killed alive. West has enormous resources. The total military expenditure of those that are members of NATO, more than $1 trillion US. NATO has provided Ukraine only one package of aid, which is 50 tons of fuel. That's all. That is why this statement that Russia is waging war against Ukraine is nonsense. NATO does not participate in this. Actually, it's one of the failure of this, as it has been announced, security organization for preserving peace and security in the Northern Atlantic area. It failed this task. So we have a very serious problem that the Western countries that are members of this great alliance have military expenditures of more than $1 trillion US, and they supplied military aid to Ukraine that is bleeding under the Russian attack, only $15 billion US over 8 months. Ukrainians are paying with their blood, with their death, with the lives of their people, because West does not provide necessary military aid that Ukraine is asking from the very beginning, even before that. Ukraine is asking for jets. The answer is no. Ukraine was asking for tanks. The answer is no. Ukraine was asking for missiles of longer range, 300 kilometers. The answer is no, still no. Ukraine was asking for all these long months, including the Ms. Zelensky, the wife of the president, for anti-missile and anti-equipment for Ukraine when she was speaking at the U.S. Congress back in, I believe, in July. Still, there is no single piece of anti-aircraft, anti-missile equipment from the United States has been delivered to Ukraine. So Ukraine is paying incredibly high price for the Western countries that have all those resources available. United States has thousands, tens of thousands of military equipment that's available today, now, yesterday. They're not provided. United States has provided 96,000 of trucks to Afghanistan army during this war. Compared to that, the United States provided only few hundreds of Humvees to Ukraine. The United States provided more than 100 jets and helicopters to Afghan army. So far, US provided only 20 old Me helicopters, old Soviet helicopters. The United States did not provide any single tank.
Andrei.
I can continue. So that is why the problem, once again, the lack of military support for Ukraine that is now became definitely one of the largest providers of security for Europe. It's donor of European security right now, Ukraine.
I hate to end on such a pessimistic note, but our time is up. I'm very sorry for those who weren't able to ask the question. And thank you once again to the organizers and to all of you attendees. Thank you for your patience. Coffee break is on.
Thank you. Okay.